Thank you, Tim, and don't tell anybody from my hometown about the accent or they will all want to come here and give talks and this kind of thing. I would really like the idea of studying myself, yes indeed, but I'm interested in public intellectuals, but I tend to do my admiring from a very safe distance. So scientists as public intellectuals is where I'm going to, is the topic of the talk, but I'd like to start with this book. Okay, everybody familiar with this book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks? This book brought bioethics and discussions of bioethics and health policy into the public domain. It was a bestseller in the US and the UK, certainly. It has been regarded as a modern cultural touchstone around popular understanding of science and popular understanding of bioethics. It tells the story of Henrietta Lacks, a young African-American woman who died from cervical cancer in St. Johns Hopkins in Baltimore in 1951. Now, as she lay dying, doctors took from her, without permission, cells from her cancerous cervix. And those cells went on to become one of the miracles of modern medicine. Okay? And the reasons for this are not quite clear, but they've gone on to contribute to treatments for hemophilia, HIV, various forms of cancer. So, hugely important story, untold story in the history of medicine, really, around exploitation of the vulnerable, the rights of research subjects, informed consent, whether the greater good outweighs informed consent. All these issues were brought out very interestingly in the book. And as I said, it became this huge cultural touchstone in many ways. But, despite all these admirable qualities of the book, I'll go on to talk about how it is really a missed opportunity for public discussion of health. A real missed opportunity for public discussion of bioethics and health policy. So I'll come back to this in a little while, but I want you to keep that thought there. It cried out for a public intellectual who would bring out the major themes in this work. Now, this idea of the public intellectual is one that is used all over the place and is used quite loosely. And the first challenge you face when you read public intellectuals' work is that there's so much of it. Much of it is confused, much of it is contradictory, much of it lacks a lot of definition. So you're all mainly legal scholars, so I want to be careful about definition and getting things right on this. There's two books that I think cut through and clarify many of these issues. The one on the left we'll turn to first, Absent Minds, and it's written by a well-known British intellectual historian, Stefan Collini. Okay, as one critic wrote, "Don't let the name fool you. He's as English as a vicarage tea party." And Collini got frustrated reading a lot of what he regarded as bad work around public intellectuals, and he wanted to provide a definition that would show what they do. And he came up with a definition that said, a public intellectual indicates performance in a role. And if you perform in this role, then you are a public intellectual. And for this to happen, four elements combined. First, there was a qualifying activity. You had to develop a reputation in a field that was esteemed for its analytic or scholarly or creative capacities. Right, so you're a biologist or a lawyer or a painter, and you develop an expertise in that area first. That's essential. Secondly, there are media channels through which you communicate about your work. Thirdly, you communicate with audiences in wider culture. And fourthly, you develop a reputation for having interesting things to say. There are not very many dull public intellectuals out there because they lack this engagement with audiences. So that covers all types of public intellectuals. Okay, a process. You develop expertise, there are media channels, you engage with audiences, and you develop a reputation for having interesting things to say. But how does this impact on policy? What's the link with policy? Collini is not great on this, but Etzioni here is quite good. And you can see his book there, Public Intellectuals and Endangered Species. And so there's no newspaper joke that if ever you see a title or a headline with a question mark, the answer is always no. Okay, so not an endangered species. And he talks about, well, what's the role of a public intellectual around policy? And he argues convincingly, persuasively, that their role lies in reframing, reformulating, and challenging assumptions that build up around a particular policy, that build up among policymakers and elites around a particular area. And public intellectuals challenge that, reframe that, shake things up. That is their primary role in culture and in policy. And this public dimension differs public intellectuals from other types of experts in public who judge between different policy options, say this one is right, this one is wrong, go with this one, not this one. Okay, their work is done in public. Usually, it's associated with the humanities, and humanities scholars are traditionally public intellectuals. So here, 4 kind of globally well-known. We have the conservative historian Neil Ferguson, top left, African-American scholar, Cornel West, Italian semiotician Umberto Eco, a novelist, bottom left, and Noam Chomsky, linguist and political economist on the right. I had a great conversation with an undergraduate last week who was doing a communication studies course, and the professor Skyped in Noam Chomsky. And I have never seen an undergraduate in communications more starstruck than speaking in person to Noam Chomsky. You can imagine how excited she was. So the point is that traditionally public intellectuals are regarded as coming from the humanities. That's where their intellectual roots are. But the idea of the scientific public intellectual is one that is growing. And it's as a result, I would argue, primarily of 2 trends. The first is movements. Now, I'm most familiar with the US and UK context, so forgive me for my lack of knowledge about the specifics of the Canadian context. But political movements in both of those countries towards what is called the public understanding of science, or public engagement with science. That's bringing citizens into the process of science and the policy making about science. Not having science policy making happening behind closed doors, but having it more democratic and inclusive. So that's one trend. The second trend is around the media itself. Now, the media naively are viewed as solely as transmitters or conduits for information. Okay? But if you spend more than an hour reading about media and society, you'll quickly see that it has a much more enhanced role. Media are agents in themselves. They shape culture and understanding. Okay? And as well as that, media are also an arena in which policy processes are brought up, examined, arranged, and perhaps decided on. And certainly within politics, media and politics have become so closely coupled as to be virtually indistinguishable in many respects. And similar, not the same, similar trends are happening within science. And this is my area of research where, media, science, and society all kind of come together. That's where I do my work. So I'm interested in these trends in media, trends in science, and trends in public thought, and they come together around specific figures. An early articulation, a very brilliant early articulation of these trends and how they came together around specific figures was the book The Visible Scientists by Ray Goodall, written in the late 1970s, focusing on US scientists who became prominent cultural figures. And her argument is that scientists like Carl Sagan, planetary scientist, like Margaret Mead, anthropologist, they changed the way science policy was discussed. Before then, before these guys came on the scene, it was sort of through behind the scenes, through committees, through reports. But Goodall argues in her book that scientists like these brought their policy advocacy into the public domain. They argued for policy through the media and became sort of instrumental in policy making around science in their respective fields, using the media and the power of their own sort of mediagenic images to decide policy. So already in the late 1970s, we're seeing this visibility issue, this formation and articulation and discussion of policy through visible figures. And this ties into another trend, one that you can see all around you. Just open your newspapers today. Media, said the eminent media critic Todd Gitlin, is more and more about what happens to well-known people. And this is talking about personalization in media, the way media refracts abstract issues, policy issues, through particular personalities. And particular personalities come to represent kind of wider social and cultural currents and trends. So this is happening largely again with these visible scientists. Now, Collini, when he talked about public intellectuals, he said that to study public intellectuals, a potentially fruitful way to do it is through the analysis of careers and public careers. And so that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to look at 3 scientists, Susan Greenfield, a neuroscientist from Britain, Steven Pinker, Canadian experimental psychologist, and Arthur Caplan, American bioethicist. And the main point, the main argument I want to show is that these public intellectuals have a vital and increasingly important role in the public understanding of health and the shaping of health policy. And this shaping happens in very complex and circuitous kind of ways. It's not often a cause and effect way, but we can talk about some specific examples. Susan Greenfield, can I just get a quick show of hands? Who has heard of her, is familiar with her in any way? 3, okay. Susan Greenfield is a very interesting figure from my point of view. If you're interested in science and public, in the British context, she's hugely interesting. A little bit about her story. She is a professor of pharmacology at Oxford. She was the first female director of the Royal Institution in Britain, which, along with the Royal Society, is the premier scientific society. But their particular brief is public understanding of science and public engagement of science. She's also in the House of Lords in Britain. Tony Blair made her a Lord, so she is quite rarely right at the heart of the policy-making process in Britain. And she's also a prolific author of popular science works as well. She's written about 10 popular science books, and we'll talk about those in a second. She fulfilled the first role of the public intellectual in the mid-1980s. She was doing research on a particular enzyme that she argued in what Science magazine called the bold thesis, that this enzyme is linked to various neurodegenerative disorders such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, and could potentially, way, way, way down the line, lead to treatments. I nearly said the B word, breakthrough. I teach science journalism, and that word is banned from the first day, breakthrough, so I nearly said it myself. So she developed her reputation in the 1980s in this field. Okay, so she was an accomplished scientist before she moved into the public domain. And how she moved into the public domain happened in 1994. Again, she's been quite pioneering as a female scientist in Britain. She was the first female scientist to give the annual Christmas lectures, okay, which is very quaint, it's very, very British, the annual Christmas lectures, where she, it's basically an eminent scientist like previous speakers, Carl Sagan, like Richard Dawkins, like David Attenborough, popularized science. And she spoke about brain science and popularized it. And she came across very well, she spoke very well, she was very engaging, she was very telegenic, she understood media, and suddenly invitations for more and more media flooded in. So she had the availability of media channels. And she quickly changed this profile into writing popular science works. And I'll talk very briefly about the progression in her intellectual in her work. She started, say, with the human brain, okay, which is a straightforward explanation of how the brain works, okay, an insider's perspective about how the brain works. Moved on to her best regarded and best known work, The Private Life of the Brain, which talked about, again, the same kind of issues, except it was a lot more polished and better. But here, these last two books, she's moved on into something much more speculative, much more different. She used her popular writing, her popular profile, to speculate about science and society. Okay? She had moved further and further from scientific evidence. Tomorrow's People, about what the world is going to be like, shaped by designer babies, cybernetics, designer drugs. And then her most controversial work, ID, how the quest for identity in the 21st century. And in that book, she outlined very, brave thing to do for a professional scientist. She said that digital culture, Facebook, video games, and the immersion in screen life of this generation will change the physical structure of their brain, change their personality, change their identity, essentially. And this she sees as only having harmful consequences. Okay, digital culture for her equals instant gratification, equals lack of ability to think in abstraction, will lead down the line to, she argues, obesity, gambling, antisocial behavior, greater hyperactive attention deficit disorder. Okay, very bold kind of thesis, way beyond what the evidence is saying. But she is explicit about this. I'm hypothesizing, I'm theorizing, I can't do this in scientific papers, so I'm doing it in popular culture. Her status allowed her to communicate in various channels. She brought questions on this topic. She raised them in the House of Lords. So these questions, in her popular book, raised directly in a policy arena. The Daily Mail newspaper, conservative newspaper in Britain, was open to these messages. Okay, so she wrote these two articles. God help us when Generation Text are running the country. That'd be kind of interesting to see what that'd be like, wouldn't it? But again, she argued in these channels, various channels, for this very speculative interpretation of what might happen in the future. And you can say here, her stature as a public intellectual allows her to do this. She's not alone in doing this. There are other cultural writings around this topic. You Are Not a Gadget, self-explanatory. What the internet is doing to our brains, excerpted in the Atlantic magazine as Is Google Making Us Stupid? And also Sherry Turtle, professor of science and society at MIT, Alone Together, basically arguing that interpersonal relationships being harmed among the young by digital media. I know I'm getting old when I start saying the young. But Greenfield, as a scientist, is slightly different in that there was a severe sort of backlash against her that came to a head with what became known as the Greenfield-ism controversy. In 2011, she gave an interview to New Scientist magazine, where she talked about digital culture and increases in autism. And she was, speculating again about what links there might be between them. So she was critiqued about this, and she followed up in The Guardian by saying this. Okay? So very quickly, a sort of internet meme took off. We have Carl Zimmer, the doyen of American science writers. In Britain, we have Ben Goldacre. And these are two of the milder ones. I won't go into some of the other ones as well, but the correlation between these things are quite slight, okay? So here we have a public intellectual. We talk about the risks of being a public intellectual. And these are some of the risks, okay? It's quite extreme here, but this is kind of like, professional ridicule a little bit, okay? An extreme kind of case here. You also have her expertise being challenged. And this is Dorothy Bishop, okay, neuropsychologist, right? In the same department as Professor Greenfield, who wrote on her blog critiquing her on scientific grounds. So you have science writers, you have fellow experts critiquing her views. And her views were first put out there as speculations, but nevertheless the backlash has been quite severe. The defenders of Greenfield, there are not many of them, but their argument is that, look, she's a major public figure. Part of her job is to hypothesize about these issues in public. I mean, you can't do this if you are a first-year postdoc in neuroscience, right? But with her statue, perhaps you can. It leads to, again, more satires. How to write a Greenfield article. All right, not very nice, okay. And I do really feel inclined to defend Greenfield in this, because she is raising legitimate issues, and the backlash she is getting are not the same as the backlash researchers in other fields are getting. So is there something special about being a scientist when you raise these issues that you won't get away with if you were perhaps a humanities scholar? Interesting one to think about. What is interesting is that when she has moved from her topic to more speculative works at the end, her impact on academic communities is, so far, there is a time element here, of course, but so far less prominent. So as she moves into being a public intellectual, her public intellectual works are not regarded as highly among her peers as her more straightforward kind of works. But what's another interesting thing about her work, this is her personal website, where she is attempting to build a research agenda around the dangers of screen technology. She's calling it mind change, all right? I mean, she's good at media mind change, drawing from the analogy from climate change. So what will be interesting to see if an idea developed and expanded and expounded through popular science now develops in a more systematic and rigorous way as a research agenda. An interesting kind of question, certainly for me looking at science and society issues. Another risk, potentially, of being a public intellectual with this media focus on personalities is that you can't take the good with the bad, that your personality is out there, so you will be investigated and critiqued in terms of your personality, if you get me. So here we have the Prof Wears Prada, the Sunday Times. Okay? Now, she has played a very strong role in being a role model for female scientists in the UK, but she has sort of been typecast. And the language surrounding her is quite feminized and quite sexualized. And you can see the representations going on here. And we talk about private lives. An article in the Daily Mail again. I don't know why the Daily Mail are obsessed with Susan Greenfield, but here we are. This is about her divorce from Peter Atkins, a well-known popularizer and chemist at Oxford. Okay, she's called in the piece glamorous, I think, and he's called rich but stodgy, which is not very nice. So you can see one particular risk here again about public intellectuals. Okay, your personality is out there as a way to engage with issues, but there is this kind of flip side, and it's like any type of renown or fame. You can't turn it off like a tap. I don't know anything about Steven Pinker's private life. I know he likes cycling and photography. I do too, so I feel closer to him already. So this is a different type of public intellectual. The same kind of patterns are here. You're all familiar with Steven Pinker, right? Yeah, Montreal born, professor of psychology at Harvard, did his undergraduate training at McGill, where he said psychology would allow him to explore the big questions of human nature. Now, Pinker started his career as an expert in visual cognition, but he moved on to language acquisition among children. That was his area of expertise, and he made several academic breakthroughs in that area that established his reputation. And then he kind of moved on to doing popularization work. Very same pattern to public intellectuals generally and Greenfield generally. His first book, still massively cited, hugely influential. American scientists called it one of the top 100 science books of the 20th century, The Language Instinct, essentially arguing that we're all hardwired for language. And since then, his work has sort of broken down generally into two main themes. Words and rules followed the language instinct, biologically hardwired for language. But he has also become a very strong public proponent of evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics. And he articulates these ideas very strongly in public, most notably in How the Mind Works and particularly The Blank Slate. His most recent book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, is a bit of a new turn for him. He's looking at how violence has declined over the course of human history. And if you haven't read Pinker, do read Pinker. He's an amazing thinker. He's an amazing synthetic intelligence. And his explanations are very clear and precise. You might not agree with him, but he's well worth reading nevertheless. Now, I could spend hours talking about him alone as a public intellectual, but I want to focus on two specific areas. One that arises in The Blank Slate. It's policy related, and it's about parenting. Okay? It's about child rearing. And Pinker in that book follows the much criticized work of Judith Rich Harris, arguing, again, public intellectuals disrupting communities of assumptions. This idea that parenting has a major impact on the personality of a child. Pinker argues that that is not the case. Okay, behavioral genetics, evolutionary psychology, the evidence there tells you that is not what's going on. Okay, what's really going on, what really affects variations in child personalities are your genes, 50%, and your peer group, 50%. Your parents, 0%. Okay, so I'm a new father, so I guess I'm just going to stay here in Alberta. It doesn't really matter. So here's an excerpt from The Blank Slate. My favorite word of the day, flapdoodle. Okay, so provocative, yes. Spiky, yes. Makes you a little bit annoyed, yes. Well, good. Good writing by a public intellectual. Now, Pinker is an esteemed academic, but he can really engage you as a reader. But what's interesting here is that these views became a sort of, and this challenger on parenting became this sort of battleground between different public intellectuals about a policy issue, about the issue of parenting. We had British clinical psychologist Oliver James, himself a public intellectual in his own right in the UK, who has advised the UK government on health issues. Okay, so he's quite close to policy too, arguing against Pinker. Okay, and you can see his book title there from that poem by Philip Larkin. Anybody knows it about parenting? They F you up. He says, well, actually, no, Pinker is wrong, that my work as a clinical psychologist, I have seen so many cases where the first 6 years of a child's life are so important, and parenting is so important. I've seen pathologies and phobias develop in specific cases. So we have Pinker arguing behavioral genetics, we have James arguing clinical case histories, we have this evidence in public, a policy-related issue, two public intellectuals going at it. Very interesting way for ideas about science and ideas about science policy and health policy to filter through culture. And these are not happening in the pages of journals, these are popular books, these are popular radio shows, these are newspaper articles. Okay, this is right in the middle of culture in which these debates are happening. Again, the power of personality and media-focused coverage. Here we have Pinker in the New York Times magazine, okay, enormously influential publication. Every time I see this, I keep wondering, is the hair still there? Should he lose the hair or not? I don't know. But so he's writing about, he's always advocated the power of genes. And when new gene sequencing technologies emerged, he volunteered very quickly to have his genome sequenced to see what he found in it. And he wrote an article about it. It's a first-person article about himself. Again, my genome, myself. Talking about what do we actually know from somebody's genome? What can we actually find out? What will it tell us about our health? It's a theme explored very interestingly by Tim in his own book. Similar kind of ideas. So the piece, it's well worth reading. I'll reference to it in a second. But Pinker talks about what they found in his genome, how it contradicted what he thought about himself. He talked about how knowing where he came from really deepened his Jewish tradition, and he felt much more connected to previous generations. But it also, this was his kind of conclusion on the matter. Okay, so he's talking about these fears raised about insurance, about, predicting what will happen, these dystopian fears as he talks about. And to me, what I loved about this article was that all these very complex issues are distilled through his personality. He discusses all these issues, okay? And he lays them out through himself. So it's a very positive version of using personality to express ideas. And again, personalization in coverage, the public intellectual taking on the responsibility of engaging a wider audience, explaining to a wider audience these complex scientific issues. Yes, there are elements of self-promotion in it, of course, but in this media environment, I think self-promotion, personalization are virtually inseparable. The last case study I want to look at is Arthur Caplan. And here I'm delighted to be speaking to lawyers and people involved in health law, because I've only started to read myself systematically into Caplan's life. So any advice and guidance that you guys have about it, I would be grateful. This is the picture that accompanies his Twitter handle. Caplan, professor of bioethics at NYU, an extraordinarily prolific scholar and public intellectual, written I think now 29 books and 600 peer-reviewed articles. I mean, I don't know what we're all doing with our time. Almost there to 600, but so he's enormously prolific. But he's also the go-to guy for journalists talking about bioethics. Okay, and one researcher, Marjorie Cruvand, proved this, looking at coverage of bioethics over time. And as you can see, Caplan, way ahead. He was at the University of Pennsylvania at the time, before he moved. Okay, so over almost 2 decades, Caplan becoming very strongly the voice of bioethics. And Cruvand's study is interesting in lots of ways, but her explanation is sort of grounded in the sociology of journalism, right? The sociology of news production. Okay, so she talks about how he became an expert source. And essentially the conclusion is that Caplan gets journalism and he gets journalists. Okay? Interestingly, he flirted with the idea of becoming a journalist. It's interesting how people flirt with the idea of becoming a journalist. Okay? I flirted and then went all the way to consummated and stayed in it for a long time before I divorced it, and I'm now doing this. But Caplan gets journalism, he understands it. And so how does this work out in practice? He calls journalists back, he understands deadlines, he speaks in sound bites, which for anybody who's ever been interviewed by a journalist is an extraordinarily difficult communication skill to do. And he knows that he can comment on a variety of expertise that the journalist is looking for. A bioethics expert to speak about X bioethics topic. Doesn't really matter. So there are some of the reasons that this study argued that he became such an expert source. So it's a good starting place, but I want to develop it on a little bit more, that to become a public intellectual, you've got to do more than just be good with journalists. There has to be something deeper going on. And again, I'm only starting to look into this, but here's some of my ideas. The first is that Caplan's public career has sort of mirrored the career, as it were, of bioethics itself. It started in the late 60s, reconciling advances in biology with human values. Okay, it's developed as a field, its own journals, several books, and it's a real interdisciplinary kind of field, straddling the sciences and the humanities, speaking to public issues, drawing on expert knowledge. You can see how it's a perfect kind of field for a public intellectual to work in. Okay, it's very different than if you are a behavioral, geneticist or an organic chemist, for example. It's quite difficult in that situation to become a public intellectual. So Caplan's career sort of mirrored the rise of bioethics. Also, Caplan himself is a really interesting guy. He studied medicine for a year but dropped out, said it wasn't for him. He did his doctorate in philosophy, actually, in the history and philosophy of science. So he understands science very well. Also, his outlook is quite suited. He's quite suited temperamentally to being a public intellectual. As a philosopher, he said he's hugely influenced by the Socratic idea of philosophy, of raising issues in the public sphere. He's hugely influenced by the ideas of John Dewey, that scholars have to be publicly engaged. And his understanding of journalism as well gives him this sort of public orientation. Okay, so he's an expert in a field that's outward looking. Himself, he's outward looking as well, contributing to his value as a bioethicist and a public intellectual. And he articulates this quite clearly himself when asked in an interview what the job is. So that's the responsibilities, okay, the role and the responsibilities. Caplan has come under a lot of critiques for his work. Okay, he's a popularizer here. Here we have Twitter, and here we have this book, but I picked this. Can you see at the very bottom here? Who's been retweeted, all right? So Caplan, talking about his Twitter use, has said, well, some people in academia think I've lost my marbles completely, but it's a real way to engage people. Again, seeing new media as a way to engage people. Here we have a book with a subtitle, An Interesting and Amusing Guide to Bioethics, which tells you everything about its audience and who it's aiming it at, self-consciously aimed at a general readership who might not be interested in it and perhaps needs words like amusing to actually pick up the book and get involved in it. Okay, so he's spreading out in all directions. But this has been heavily critiqued. This work has been heavily critiqued. Okay, he's been accused, perhaps disparagingly, as a celebrity. But the major critiques that have emerged that Kruvvad identified in her study surround expertise and the nature of bioethics expertise. Caplan says, or one study about him said he started as a generalist in a field that has now become dominated by specialists. And so what is the links between being a public intellectual and expertise? What goes on there? Is there some sort of a trade-off that if you're speaking so often in public, what does that do to your inter-field reputation? You know, because Caplan has spoken on face transplants, cloned animals, ethics in sport, Viagra. And the issue is raised as well, how many things can you speak about knowledgeably without that knowledge becoming sort of, I don't want to say, what's the right word, debased or devalued, or distilled perhaps, good way of putting it. Just one critique that often emerges. And it's inherent in all types of public intellectual work, if you're a historian or a scientist, this tension between specialization and general expertise, sort of a constant back and forth. And to succeed as a public intellectual, you need to do both. Okay? Be public, but also publish for your peers, public peers. It's the way to survive over the long term in this area. The other critique about Caplan, and it's a more interesting one, is that, as you will know in bioethics, the field is so broad. You know, Catholic, Protestant, communitarian, libertarian bioethicists, all different perspectives and worldviews, right? Bringing to bear on the topic. But the risk, argued one other bioethicist, is that Caplan speaks for bioethics. He becomes the voice of bioethics, in that all bioethicists come from the same perspective. And that is a potential kind of risk of his kind of work. So to go back to where we began, and the missed opportunity of Henrietta Lacks to engage wider audiences. This is a study I carried out with my colleague Matthew Nisbet at American in a series edited by Tim, and we looked at the media impact of the book. How did the media take up the themes of the book? Like, the major theme in the book was informed consent around Henrietta Lacks. But how did this cultural product ignite or not ignite wider discussions about the issue? And so what we did was we read some of the bioethics literature, we read the stories and came up with a typology of themes, ethical themes in the book and in discussions of bioethics generally. And these will be familiar to many of you there, running everything from informed consent to advocacy of different perspectives. So all these themes are sort of there to different degrees in the book. Informed consent is the main one. But we wanted to see how they played out in subsequent coverage. And what we found, perhaps unsurprising here, informed consent dominated. Main theme of the book, main theme of reviews, main theme of interviews, main theme of profiles. Okay? Again, as someone who teaches science journalism, it's somewhat disappointing that journalists didn't use this as a starting point, okay, to move beyond what was in the book, to spark this wider discussion. And this is why I say it cried out for a public intellectual to take this issue, to change it around, to reframe it, to say, actually, no, there are other things here to look at. There's advocacy issues, there's privacy issues brought up in this book that we need to look at. And we argued for this, Matt and I, in a piece in The Scientist, about the need to debate bioethics openly. And controversies and major cultural events are not challenges to bioethics, but they're real opportunities to engage audiences and catalyze this wider discussion, this civic engagement around these issues. And soon after, okay, this is an example of our study, our article, Caplan says, so it's like, you know, like a Greenfieldism, that is all. But Caplan talks about a recent development in this case where the NIH in the US has settled with the Lax family, and any researcher that wants to use Lax's genome must ask for permission now. Okay, and must be given an acknowledgement in the resulting study. So again, it's about time, says Arthur Caplan, and this is his column with NBC News. Now, not many academic researchers have columns with major news organizations, so that in itself is an indicator of prominence. But interestingly, here's what he says towards the end. And it's the second sentence I'd like you to focus on. So here we have good public intellectual work, reframing the issue. Right, informed consent, that's been the major focus until now. We need to reframe this. We need to focus more on privacy issues. So here Caplan is taking on this reframing role. And this, again, will be interesting to see what happens from this, whether subsequent work, there is this tilt towards privacy and other issues. So then to conclude, roles, risks, and responsibilities of the scientific public intellectual. The first point is that as science, media, health, and health policy become ever more entwined with media as agents and arenas, that these roles are likely to stay prominent or perhaps intensify in their prominence. Okay? The responsibility, and I spoke at the start this idea of the public understanding of health and health policy. Again, it's quite a nebulous term. What exactly does it mean? The definition I think is most clear is one of the earliest by a pioneer in the field of science communication, John Durant, who argued in Nature that there are three parts, public understanding of science. Three parts. One, facts and concepts, pretty straightforward. Two, how science works, the nature of evidence, the scientific process, peer review. And lastly, how science really works. And this is science embedded in economic, social, ethical contexts that shape how that science proceeds. And real public understanding of science, real public understanding of health and health policy addresses these three dimensions, brings all of these dimensions out in the open. So it opens the black box of science and health policy, brings them all out into the open. The risks, then, we've seen some of them here. Challenges to reputation, challenges to expertise, although these forces are not as prominent as they perhaps once were. I think Pinker and Caplan are doing quite okay, really. One risk, the risk about if you put yourself forward as a personality in media, then you will be treated as a personality by media. It's a potential personal kind of risk there too. And the last risk is it's one about policy debates and cultural debates. And I'll reference here the Italian sociologist of science, Massimiliano Bucchi, who writes very well about these visible scientists. And he notes that with these trends in media, that what might end up happening is that discussions about science and society, discussions about health policy, end up being reduced to discussions among highly visible figures. And paradoxically, some voices get crowded out, that it becomes perhaps the same figures discussing things over and over again, with potentially detrimental consequences for public debate and policy debate. These problems and tensions are intractable. They're not going to go away. They're kind of inherent in the logic of public intellectuals themselves and how they perform and how they influence culture, society, and policy. Okay, thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions.
We have questions? I've got one at the start. Go back, do you want to go?
Sure. Great talk, Declan. So I wanted to ask about someone like Mr. Hitchens.
Yeah.
And the problem of expertise here.
Yes.
It seems to me that it's not possible to wear two hats. To be an academic and be a public intellectual. Something has to be. These guys have busy schedules. They always on demand. One wonders about whether the expertise critique is actually really valuable. Because if you want to compare these guys to someone like Mr. Hitchens, who just does this for, who used to do this for fun,
Mm-hmm.
right? And who will be regarded as an intellectual.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to explore the expertise problem a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and talk about what you see as what might be missing from the academic careers in that respect.
Okay, I would say that first of all, Hitchens is a sort of different category. I mean, he always saw himself as a journalist and a polemicist and a controversialist. Okay, so that was his job. His job was to get in amongst these debates and contribute to these debates. And there's a very long history within journalism of columnists, particularly, that this is their professional role. So Hitchens is doing this as part of his professional role. Whereas here, I think I would argue here that this is something new. This is not traditionally part of the scientific vocation, as it were. That this, speaking in public is something kind of different. Okay, this is going to sound bad, but I'm going to give you an answer based on the sociology of science. Okay, I'm not going to drown out with expertise, but there's interesting work in that field that talks about how science itself and the values around science has changed, particularly in the past 30 or 40 years, with pressures from industry, commercial pressures, public accountability pressures, that the view of scientific work as happening just in laboratories, just at conferences, just in research papers, is a little dated, and that there are increasing pressures on science as a whole, in particular scientists, to be publicly accountable, not just for their own work, but for pitching for grants, for example, or for telling politicians and policymakers why their work is justified, and also for justifying the role of science in society itself. Science can't happen behind closed doors. Science is happening to a greater degree in public now. So in that professional context, these scientists are reflecting those values by communicating in public, is an argument that I would make for it. The argument about expertise, I think, as I said, is one that's just intractable in public intellectual work. And this is whether you are a historian or a literary critic or a experimental psychologist. There will always be a tension between expertise and general commentary. And the public intellectual sort of tick-tocks back and forth between the two. If you leave the expertise behind, you become perhaps something else. You become a media figure, or you become just but a popular science writer. Okay, you are a different category there. But if you are fulfilling the role of the public intellectual, as Kalini outlined, then this tension will be with you, and you can expect criticisms about expertise.
Okay. I'm going to
Yep.
jump in if that's okay. That's an interesting point, but I've seen studies that have said that. I think it was one with, I remember there's a study with Arthur Caplan, I think it was Carl Sagan, and they mapped their actual peer review articles and said, look, they increased, they didn't decrease. And so and this person was saying it's unfair. And I think it was for Carl Sagan.
No, it was, yeah, indeed. It's actually, it became known as the Sagan effect. And it was a perception thing. It was the more media popular work that you're doing, I mean, you can't possibly be doing any real science if you're doing that. Okay? So there was this perception that Sagan wasn't a great scientist. When in fact, over the course of Sagan's career, he published like one peer-reviewed journal article a month, as well as everything else. I mean, his productivity was extraordinary. And there's a great study on this that looks at how false this is around Sagan. And Caplan talks about it as well. He was interviewed about this question of expertise, and he called it the Sagan syndrome. He goes, but I haven't really found that. That hasn't been the case for me. And another study, might be the one you're thinking of, I think looked at Norwegian researchers across all fields, and they found that the most prolific popularizers were also the most prolific researchers. They were just very prolific people.
Sorry. Here and then. Go ahead.
Okay. So the other gentleman was talking a bit about expertise and the lack, or that the concern is that it might be decreased. But what about public personalities who aren't scientists but are claiming to have an opinion on it? And we can all think of examples, especially vaccine debates, stuff like that. So do you think that's just a trend that's happening right now, or do you think that's always going to be a challenge when there is increased public intellectuals with respect to science? There's going to be a large body of non-experts who claim to have valid opinions on it.
Yes, that will be the case, and will likely to continue to be the case in different sort of controversies, whether they science-related controversies, whether they be vaccines, whether they be climate, because these debates are driven often by values and not by science. But it's what happens when scientific issues and policy issues are discussed in public. There will be many voices there talking about these issues. Where the public intellectuals can come in is that they can offer a counter view. They can offer a strong evidence-based opinion counter to these views. And then people reading these articles, reading these books can perhaps hopefully come to their own conclusions about it. So it's a consequence of openness.
Saw some hands, another hand up here, and then here, and we'll get over this side.
Peter Brindley, I'm a clinician, critical care doctor, and son of a biochemist, and I mentioned that because that's what I'm going to say.
Sure.
You would laugh if you thought I was here defending science. But it's a terrific talk, I thoroughly enjoyed it, but you come from the area of communications, and therefore, if I may take gentle issue with one or two of the words you use.
Well, of course.
Of
course.
Science is not a body of knowledge, it's a way of addressing phenomena. And the reason I think it matters and others think it matters is because it is very different from the world we live in, where there is a tendency, because people want to believe something, that will filter through the data to find the confirmatory bias that they require. And science doesn't do that. And it's rather interesting that you use words when you mention the neuroscientist, particularly, like there was a backlash. Well, there isn't a backlash. There was science. And it's very interesting that the public regards that as a backlash. It's very interesting that people will say, I feel the need to defend this person. Don't defend that person. Attack that person, because that's what science is. It's trying to disprove your passionately held beliefs by actually being somewhat more objective about them. As a son, I used to be babysat at the back of Dad's lectures, and he would give his lecture, and at the end I would think, you showed them Dad, and then the entire audience would attack him, which as a child I thought was extremely mean. And it took years and years and years to realize that's what science is. And therefore, if you can just expand on this,
Sure.
very interesting discussion you gave where basically people's earlier work was regarded as science, but became less scientific as it became more public. Because a lot of us struggle with this trade-off. Do I want to be a scientist and produce something from my field that's pure and therefore truly influential, or do I want to have something sort of filtered out so that others can find it amusing and do with it what they will?
It's a very interesting question. The second part is very interesting because it's strongly coming towards, you mentioned bias, but it's a traditional view of some scientists who popularized that somehow their work is a second order activity. Okay, I disagree respectfully. But to the first point, Greenfield has asked this question all the time. So I'll answer in her words. And she said, well, look, there really isn't any evidence for the claims that you're making. There is very speculative, tentative, early evidence that's really not conclusive either way. And her response is, well, what evidence do you think there should be? You cannot go into a laboratory and find this stuff out. You cannot do experimental work now to find out about generational change among young minds. Are we going to wait 20 years and then do the experiments? She says, well, what I'm doing is hypothesizing. I'm saying that there are indications that this might be the case. So I'm posing this hypothesis and seeing whether there's anything there. The difference is she's making this hypothesis not in the scientific literature, but in popular literature. And that is a valid critique, and it's one that comes out again. If you are going to hypothesize like this, hypothesize in journals first. So it's how you see the role of the scientific public intellectual. If it's only to contribute approved, agreed knowledge, or if it's in conditions of high uncertainty, like dangers of screen cultures, potential dangers of screen cultures, then that type of evidence is not going to be there. That certainty is not going to be there.
Thanks very much, Dr. Really enjoyed it. One of the questions has already been asked, so I'm going to ask you a slightly different one. We've had in Canada in the last 24 hours a rather startling example of a very publicly known scientist stepping into a very hot policy debate on his deathbed. That scientist happened to be married to someone who used to be a journalist, so that didn't hurt. And so one of the most prominent scientists probably in North America, possibly over the world, dealing with the SARS issue. Was evident down low. And anybody who followed that issue in Canada would have known about Don Lowe and known that he was an outspoken and really good scientist. He died of brain cancer 3 days ago or 4 days ago, and then a week before he died, he made a movie making an argument for assisted suicide. Perfectly legitimate thing to do. But when Don Lowe makes an argument for assisted suicide, it has a much bigger impact than if Joe Blow or even Kevin Keogh makes an argument for assisted suicide. Is there a difference between Lowe making an argument for assisted suicide, which has nothing to do with his expertise, but certainly a lot to do with him and others, and Linda McCartney making an argument against vaccines because they call autism? Are they basically in the same boat as public?
The short answer is no. I don't think so. No, I don't think so. And it goes back to expertise and qualifications about to make these claims. And this goes into a much wider discussion about the values that journalists bring to, who gets the right to make claims in public. And that's a different discussion. And so, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but just with values of prominence and personality and celebrity being as they are, if you are prominent, like Linda McCartney, you do have claim on making a claim to journalists because of your prominence. That's the value that's there. Whether or not they carry equal weight, I don't think so, personally, no. But that's one that gets filtered out in journalistic reporting and gets filtered out through the audience, I would argue. As to, I'm sorry, it sounds like a fascinating case. I haven't been following it closely. But
It came up in the last 24 hours.
oh no, I'm really fascinated to find out more. Public intellectuals are one role. There are several other roles that scientists may play, and there's a great book by Roger Pelkey Jr. called The Honest Broker, for scientists in policy making, and we can perhaps talk about that afterwards. But he outlines several different roles, separate to these ones here, that they may play.
I see the class outside rumbling. Is there any other really quick questions? Quick ones? Real quick one, Kalina.
Just a quick one. So I'm wondering why you're using the term public intellectual and not celebrity intellectual, because it seems to me public intellectual is a notion which is grounded in this historical tradition of intellectuals providing substantial contribution to the public debate. And the scientists who were talking about it, they seem to be more like, their impact is being measured by ratings, like Google ratings and citation ratings, and they seem to be like popular because they are cited as experts by the media. So
I am delighted with that question, because a whole research agenda of mine is scientists as celebrities. But celebrity and public intellectual are very different kind of concepts, okay, very different analytic categories. And to be honest, I didn't want to mix them up too much in this talk. But work I'm looking at now is how public intellectual work and the processes of celebrity are kind of crossing over. And they happen here in these cases there too. So maybe you'll invite me back and I'll talk about scientists as celebrities.
Absolutely, we'll make that. I promised he'd be great. He was great. He delivered. You can see why he's going to be a prominent public celebrity intellectual in the very near future. November 14th is our next. I believe that's correct. Personalized medicine. It's going to be critique. Personalized medicine, fantastic speaker. Eric Youngst, also arguably a public intellectual. Thank our funders, CIHR, Alberta Innovates. Alberta Law Foundation. Let's thank them anyway. Thank you, Alberta Law Foundation.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for coming.
Yeah,
Really
thank you so
appreciate it.
much. We appreciate it. Thanks.